Okay, well, I wanted to thank John for interrupting my talk as well. And that. Apparently, I was in a meeting when we started talking about the celebration, and I said, well, if you need to talk about history, maybe I could do that. And that evolved into doing the talk. Right? So nothing more special than that. Random chance. Because there's lots of us who have been involved in this for 40 years. Jim Scott, Gary Murashima, I saw Scott Marshall. There's lots of guilty parties, right? So anyhow, I have put together what is really a limited talk about the history, because if you really talk about the history of the PSC, you're really talking about the history of cooperation back to 1892. 1896 was the first review between the United States and Canada on fishing Fraser sockeye, right? And that review said there's no problem, we're good. No problem in the Fraser River District. Until 1913, which then, with the CN Railway developed, was the cause of Hell's Gate, landslide, right? And we suffered the consequence of that until it was really until the late 40s, 1940s, because there were a number of factors preceding the collaboration, and I'm just going to touch on how this all develops. So where am I on that? Okay. I do want to point out that we really do cover a huge area, and to just put it bluntly, we have huger problems than that. Okay, so I literally have been involved in the Salmon Treaty since I arrived on the west coast of Canada. So in September 1979, my wife and I arrived in Nanaimo, BC, and I was to work in salmon. I came out to work under Dick Beamish in groundfish, and he stole me into salmon. So that was the first twist I should have seen coming. And within a month, I was in one of the negotiating sessions, and I'd never before seen a Pacific salmon. And when I asked anybody about that, they said, forget it, you don't need salmon. You just need to know what we're talking about, right? So it was all about the numbers. And how many people remember the numbers? Because Ken Henry and Vic Arrow would literally unfold, massive spreadsheets on ledger paper. And they knew fisheries and species, months, and they were all in pencil. And if you asked one of them what the number was, they'd argue over 55 or 57. And they knew every bloody entry. It was amazing the knowledge that these individuals had accumulated. So that's where we start from. But if you actually go back in time, going the wrong way again, we go all the way back to 1892. So I said that there was the first review in 96, not a problem. Then the landslides, of course, and devastating loss of 2 years, and then the ongoing loss of production for a number of years until it's repaired. But the other thing that was going on is early in the 1911, apparently the first record of U.S. seiners going outside Juan de Fuca to catch sockeye first. Because the problem was there was some variation in how the sockeye were migrating, which we all still know, north and south, and the Americans were not always catching what they considered their fair share of the catch. So this started the discussion. Eventually we come around to the first agreement, 1937, responsibility for the 50-50 allocation between countries. They had responsibility for assessment and research. And so the IPSFC really started to play the major role. And if you really want to know it in detail, the John Roos wrote the Bible on it. This is a very detailed book, an excellent source of our history, right? Still available for sale at PSC, right? Huh? And on the website. And on the website, that's right. Good point. The one thing I didn't know until I reviewed John's book is that in 1971-72, there was an interesting occurrence where the IPSFC developed a major enhancement program for Fraser sockeye. All with spawning channels. They were going to build 12 sockeye channels and 3 pink channels. It was all worked out, went to governments, and the US said, yes, we're supportive of this. And Canada said no. But why did they say no? It's right there. Canada said no because we had already started talking about a comprehensive salmon agreement for the entire coast. And they basically said, we don't think it's worth our investment now until we can control salmon interceptions. So on the basis of that, they did not support the proposal, right? It's the first time I really tracked the salmon interceptions until you get to the next book, which is by Shepard and Argue, which for the Americans, you should all shudder, right? Those are people who are very alienated to dealing with giving any Americans a deal in that. And for somebody that came in with complete neophyte, they're going, well, this is not a positive environment, right? This is very aggressive in that. But this is an excellent source. They have done a very good job tracking this book, or tracking the evolving history of the PST. And it goes back to the late 1960s, and in 1971, they actually reached an agreement on the principles, right? And if you read the principles from 1971, I don't know if you can all read them, but I tried to put them in there as close as I can. Basically, what you're talking about is the countries have to reap the benefits from their production and reduce interceptions. 1971 now, right? And then you went to, because it's impossible to fish shores without catching the others, there had to be limited interceptions and a balance. And because there was uncertainty about returns, of course, we had to balance these interceptions over time. Sound familiar? 1971, right? Never agreed to formally, but never rejected, right? And then we enter a period in the mid-70s where 11 intensive negotiating sessions from 71 to 69. Some of you probably were involved in some of those. I was not, arriving in September 79. But these were described in the book as intensive. But 70s was a very difficult period of time to reach agreement on almost anything. And that there's a long list of things that developed in the 70s, not the least of which was the Bolt decision in the United States. So that really changed the targeted fish and how you balance the fishery and that. The other thing that I think, just in the shortness of time, in 1975 we started with microcomputers, right? This sounds silly to emphasize this, right? But when I arrived at the Pacific Biological Station in '79, there was not a single database. There was no computer record of catch, escapement, biological samples, CWT, enhancement, you name it, there was nothing. So if you really wanted to get into detailed assessments and do more to advise industry, you were starting from scratch. And we did. We had a VAX computer in the basement of PBS managed by Andy's dad, John, and that was our computer, and that one person at a time, right? So, and then the microcomputers came along, and that many times I've said we should have kept a copy of every one of them because I think the CTC tried them all, right? So everywhere we went. Now, a big thing of huge cooperation really occurred when we went to the Linwood meeting, and that was October 1980, and we could not reach agreement because in the northern boundary with Alaska and BC, we did not have agreement on the movement of the fish, the abundance of the stocks, and so on. And so it started the Northern Tagging Program, largest tagging program ever conducted on salmon. It was reviewed by Don Bevan, who was then the dean at U of W, and he had done the previous big study and that. So this was a huge undertaking. Is Mike Staley here? I thought I'd seen him, but maybe not. Mike Staley and I designed this thing. And because the computer was only one person at a time, for 3 months, I worked from midnight to 8 o'clock. And that I could run the computer model once a night. And that's how you design the study, because simulation then was one trial at a night, and see what you got out of it. And but thankfully, John arranged that I was the only one that had access at midnight. I was not popular at home. Okay, so what did we get to? We got to the largest tagging program in history. We actually looked at how Skeena and Nass sockeye approached the coast and how they moved through the existing fisheries at the time, all done with external tags. Over 400,000 external tags put on in the 4 years of the study, right? And it was collaborative. It was NOAA, ADF&G, DFO, the industry, and Carl's here for LGL Consulting. They managed the program in Canada, right? But this was a big program. The chalice there, the golden chalice, is Rick Hogan's boat. Rick's apparently not with us this week, but Rick was my captain. He managed the commercial side, and we had tags going on at all the fisheries. We had multiple recoveries. We tagged fish in the main rivers, and in many of the small populations, we built Alaskan floating fences. Right, so Alaska had done this in their area, and we taught us how to do it in ours. So this occurred on sockeye and pink for 4 years, and still being used for the run reconstruction. Right, so a fabulous example of a collaboration between countries. But eventually we did. Oh yeah, I wanted to call a couple of pictures. There's Rick. And as I say, Rick's not here, unfortunately, but I lived with Rick on the chalice for about 3 summers, and he liked to stand there and survey his catch. And then to prove that I actually did work, that's me with Lynn Yamanaka, who some of you know worked for DFO for a number of years, and that on Vanilla Lake, because there were small lake sockeye that we had to put the fences in. And then on the other side is the beginning. This is the first sampling of sockeye GSI. So this is where we started sampling for, that's Ron Katawaki and Carl English. And then, there we go, Archie Neese. And we did tagging in the Skeena and the Nass rivers. We had to do secondary, what we call secondary tagging in the big rivers, because if you didn't, you had too much air in the escapement, so that was the reason for it. And that. But we finally did get to an agreement, right? I have to admit, after finally getting there, this is the worst picture in the world, right? This is all we have, but apparently it is. And that I put the 4-leaf shamrock up there because really had to be lucky to get there. It didn't really last very long, though, did it? Because what happened immediately after was we started to see a change in the interception balance. We started to see a change in the migration of the sockeye coming down the north. And we had the 1982-83 El Nino. And that destroyed West Coast Vancouver Island Chinook. And the reason for that's important is we suddenly went from a fishing program and a big treaty to a conservation need to pass fish from Alaska through the Canadian fisheries, through terminal fisheries, and back into these streams. Significantly complicated our life. So, what happens then, of course, is the frustration builds, and we enter what Wikipedia calls the salmon wars, right? Obviously, lots of expression of frustration, but there was a lot of effort going on behind the scenes to continue the agreement. That probably the most important step in my review is in 1995, the United States makes the first big offer. There's an acknowledgement that the United States is taking more fish than interceptions. There's an offer of cash compensation, and that instead of changing the fisheries outright. And then the other part was, if you go for the cash compensation, it's linked to a new management plan called abundance-based management, which is, of course, where we went, right? And The cash, of course, evolved into the endowment funds. It also led, a couple of years later, to Glenn Clark going to the Washington courts and trying to say that the American fishermen had broken the treaty and he wanted compensation. This was not well received by Canadian government or the media. All right, so this is the nice picture. There are a number of others that are not as complimentary, but we'll go back here. And then, of course, came the Strangway and Ruggles House report, and they spent 2 years doing this work for us, as we know, and came back, and the quote, I think, is worth actually emphasizing. For too long, good faith and trust have been missing elements in our dealings with salmon and one another. It's time to go to work on preserving the fish and restoring our centuries-old friendship and cooperation. And of course, shortly after that was the 1999 agreement. So I guess we took it to heart. Now, I just want to point out on the endowments what an incredible job these panels have done and how important this has been to us. So here are the numbers. Of course, the initial investment is $140 million US in 2 funds. They're invested and managed by the board. They're currently valued at about twice the original value. And that's after investing in, what have we got here? Almost 2,000 projects, right? And you've invested about $150 million. What an excellent example of the collaboration, right? So this has been a wonderful investment. And I want to give you one example because it recognizes a wonderful person. When I was developing the Salish Sea Marine Survival Program with the Pacific Salmon Commission and Long Live the Kings, Larry Rudder, then a commissioner, was really involved in this, and he loved the idea. So he made the pitch to the endowment for a $5 million investment. The reason for that is there's a golden rule in raising money. You got to have money to make money. All right? And so Larry sold this. He got us $5 million over a 5-year period. We turned that into $40 million in investments, a very successful program that has now had 60 organizations involved, 200 researchers, and we're currently sitting at 126 publications from this investment. So Larry, great guy, John and I discussed what picture to use. I decided to go with this one because it's more to his character. He was jovial, he was knowledgeable, he was just a wonderful person to work with. Right? It's sad we missed him way too early. Okay, so after we evolved from our teenage years of bickering, we've sort of come to the mature adults and this is the last 20 years. Yeah, you should laugh. Lots of examples of good development. Major one in Canada really being the development of the First Nation agreements and new laws in Canada. There has been a great evolution of activities here. And I wanted to point out one that I've actually highlighted on my own is, look on the PSC website and look for the data mobilization. This is a huge evolution of data accessibility to the public and for people to use. It's a wonderful example that has been developed by, I'm sure, your team, Fiona, probably the lead, but this is a great tool to look at if you haven't seen it. All right? Very, very informative in that. But as I finish up, I was saying to myself, well, what do you think people are going to say about us? What are they going to say at the 50th or the 60th? So I couldn't help being a scientist. Grace, I've got to do something on this. We have some great examples right outside our door about what we have to do. All right? So one of the things on the the data website, take a look at the trends in Fraser sockeye. This is not a positive trend. All right? In 2009, Canada suffered through the Cohen Commission. Huge investment. Right? I spent hundreds of hours in this courtroom and that. And what I was talking about is 2009 as being the worst ever sockeye return. And there was lots of concerned people that gave evidence. What happened in 2010? 30 million sockeye the next year, right? And when I talked to Judge Cohen after, he goes, what the hell? He spent all that time and what did we get from it? Harvest rates are down. We've lost one of the two dominant lines. We're down to one. The off-cycle lines are fractions of what they were, and we're still proceeding to try and manage them on an annual basis, right? We're missing opportunities here. The other part, we've talked about the demographic change that's going on with climate. It's right here. Here's Fraser female and that 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds. Don't worry about all the details. Look at the trend in the lines. They're all going down. Steve Latham generated this for me, so thanks, Steve. There's no question that we're to have declining productivity in Fraser sockeye. It's there now. So given all this, what do we do? Right? So this is the science component now. Everybody listening? Number one, I don't think there's any question that we are, without question, the people that should be looking at what is going on in the Fraser. Right? It would be huge to restore production for fisheries in Washington, and Canada. Right? That is a worthwhile investment that we could tackle. Number two is that we talk about climate change effects and what it means for us. We have people from a latitudinal range of over 2,500 kilometers. We can measure change right in front of us. We've got all the people in the areas to study these effects. We just haven't got it integrated. We haven't put it together, right? Clearly something that PSC could do. And the last part, and this is more of a bit that I've been working on recently, we have the technologies now to do an excellent job in monitoring the ocean to look for advance notice of major changes in productivity. So the huge errors that we see in forecasting, we could reduce that. We have all the technology, we have all sorts of chemical analyses we could do. We haven't put it together. We just haven't done it. Right, so to close, and I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm over time. Right, Fiona? We've had our challenges, let's not kid ourselves, right? We've had lots of debates and that. We have lots of differing opinions. I don't expect that to change. But what I think is really noticeable is we have a long history of working through our problems and getting to solutions. So to me, we have a great legacy. All right? We should be proud of this legacy. All right? But we can do more. And that we have the endowments, we know what we can do and what's going to be a good return, and we just have to keep working together because we've done a great job. So, congratulations.